Welcome to our tutorial about creating a connection. We used connections many times in this course already. In this particular tutorial, we're going to learn a little more about what happens when a database connection is created. Let's start by saying that generally on a live server, the connection is limited to some fixed number, and if you exceed this fixed number, for example, if you run out of licenses, if the server isn't able to handle the user load, in these cases, an attempt to create a new connection will fail. For this reason, you need to keep your connection open for the shortest period of time possible. It's also a good idea to write this code inside a try-catch error handling structure so that you'll be in control of a situation if an error happens to occur. Here I've created a new website project. Here are the files on my hard drive. The folder is called app_data. This folder is usually where you'll store your data files. I'm going to drag my user's database from my previous project and drag it into the app_data folder. Let's copy it here. The second file here is the SQL Server Database Transaction Log file. You can copy this too, but it's not necessary. That's because Visual Studio will create a new file the first time the connection is established. Now let's open the Server Explorer. If you don't see it, you can activate it from the View menu. Just choose Server Explorer and the panel should be available. Now let's click Connect to Database. We'll change the data source. We'll choose an MS SQL Server database file. Let's click OK. Now we'll browse for the database file. As you know, it's here inside our app_data folder. Open. Now when I click Test Connection, a message displays telling me my connection was successful. Visual Studio has now created a database transaction log file in the app_data directory. Let's click OK. We're going to expand the Tables folder in our Server Explorer tab. And let's drag the Users table into a cell. As we've seen previously, the connection is established automatically. Let's go to the Solution Explorer tab. Let's open the web config file. Here is our connection string code. Let's take a moment to talk about the elements of this code. Under Provider Name, we see SQL Client namespace here. This namespace contains classes that you use to connect to Microsoft SQL Server Database version 7.0 and up, as well as executing commands. Those classes like SQL Command and SQL Connection provide the same properties and methods as their counterparts in system.data.oledb namespace. The only difference is that they're optimized for SQL Server, and they provide better performance by eliminating the extra OLEDB layer and by connecting directly to the optimizing TDS interface. Next here you see the user connection string 1, which we just created. If I click on the Smart tag and select Configure Data Source, you see the connection. User connection string 1. Let's expand this plus sign to view an exact copy of the connection string. It's the exact same thing that we see in the web.config file. The connection string is a collection of distinct pieces of information separated by semicolons. Each separate piece is known as a connection string property. For example, attach_dbf file name supplies the path to our database. Here, data directory appears between two pipes. This automatically points to the app_data folder inside the application directory. This way, you don't need to supply the full file path, which might not remain valid when you migrate your web application to your web server. Instead, ADO.NET will always look inside the app_data folder for your database file. Another example of the connection string property is the data source. This indicates the name of the server where the data source is located. It can be an IP address or a server address. For example, if you install SQL Server 2005 Express Edition, which probably happened when you installed Microsoft Visual Studio, you'll see localhost/SQL Express, or instead of localhost, just a period, which is the equivalent. Basically, you're using a data source to establish communication between your application and your database over the network. Another parameter of the connection string is integrated security. This indicates that you want to connect to SQL Server using the Windows user account that's running the web page code under the assumption that you'll supply the value of SSPI, which stands for Security Support Provider Interface. The next property we see here is Connect Timeout. The Connect Timeout parameter determines how long your code will wait, and the time is measured here in seconds, before generating an error if it can't establish a database connection. If you use 0, this will specify no time limit. Now that's not a good idea, because it means in theory that the code can be held indefinitely while attempting to contact the server. Let's take a look at the user instance property now. This refers to the fact that a copy of the original database has been loaded into memory and you're working with the copy. It can have a Boolean value of true or false. My last remark about the connection string. Typically, all the database coded in your application will use the same connection string. For this reason, it makes sense to store the connection string in one place, like for example the web.config file. The user connection string 1 is a key name. If I switch to the default page, let's go to the source code. We see the connection string property here, and it points to the key name user connection string 1. This concludes our tutorial on creating connections.